think I've talked about this before, but I've got roughly two kinds of books that I find myself keeping in my collection. The first are the ones that I agree with or that I feel spiritually or intellectually aligned with, and so of course I go back to them again and again. And then there are a few other books that I feel myself conflicted about because there are parts of it that I may agree with completely and parts of it that I find myself stridently disagreeing with. But at the same time, I find the vision in the book to be magnetic and fascinating all the same. And I can't quite get the book out of my collection for that exact reason. I come back to it sometimes just to wrestle with it, just to spar with it, just to say, you're wrong, but I agree with this. And one of the books that I found myself doing that with a great deal was something that I discovered when I was still in high school and that I've owned on and off and which I recently rebought and added back to the collection, probably for keeps at this point. And it's a book called The Making of a Counterculture by Theodore Roszak. And it is subtitled Reflections on the Technocratic Society and Its Youthful Opposition. The book was published in 1969, and it's basically an amalgam of several essays loosely knit under the same topic, which all deal with, as the title implies, the rebellion of the young against the technocracy of the old during the late 60s. And there's no question the author is biased in favor of the younger generation, because so many of their complaints are also his complaints, that modern life has started to turn into an assembly line to hell, and that so many of the things that we thought were going to be boons have turned out to be net negatives, or at the very least have come with a cost that we don't know how to offset. And so in the late 60s, there was much more, there was the first big wave of public manifestation of resistance against what he calls the technocratic ideal, the idea that everything can be reduced to efficiency as an underlying value, the idea that we can still have gigantic nuclear arsenals as long as nobody uses them, that it's probably better for us to repress emotions or at least divert them into, channel them into respectable activities than to simply cultivate them like wild gardens, things like that. And the book explores this from a number of different angles, some of which are more sympathetic than others. There's one chapter, for instance, about psychedelic drugs called The Counterfeit Infinity, and the fact that the word counterfeit is in the title should give you a strong hint of how he feels about it. And the gist of how he feels about all this can be summed up in the last paragraph of the section, which reads, "Better things for better living through chemistry." So reads one of the prominent hippie buttons, quoting E.I. DuPont. But the slogan isn't being used satirically. The wearers mean it the way DuPont means it. The gadget-happy American has always been a figure of fun because of his facile assumption there exists a technological solution to every human problem. It only took the great psychedelic crusade to perfect the absurdity by proclaiming that personal salvation and the social revolution can be packed in a capsule. So this line here, there exists a technological solution to every human problem, that's also an encapsulation, in Roszak's view, of what's wrong with the technocratic worldview, that it sees the world as a series of problems to be solved instead of a series of experiences to be experienced, that it relates to the world in an I-it way, to quote Martin Buber, as opposed to an I-thou way. One of the other things I like about this book is that it introduced me to a number of people that I didn't know about and that I have subsequently investigated on my own and found to be really worth the trouble. And one of them is the sociologist Paul Goodman. And there's a whole chapter devoted to this man in the book. And that was my first big introduction to him. And it's actually well worth reading as a general introduction to Goodman's work, which is now coming back into print and getting a very nice reevaluation after many years of being sidelined. And a big part of that was because Goodman himself was a very mercurial figure. He didn't appeal to everybody. He sometimes was his own worst enemy in terms of figuring out how to make a case for the things that he wanted to make a case for. But he had the same kind of fiery resistance to the dehumanization and depersonalization that he saw all around him, even before the Second World War, that the younger generation that Roszak talks about also manifests. Now, I mentioned before that there are places where I diverge sharply from the book, and that's mainly towards the end of the book, especially in the chapter entitled The Myth of Objective Consciousness. And I feel like this is where Roszak starts to go too far in the other direction, where he starts to make a case that is not merely anti-technocratic, but anti-rational and anti-scientific. And that's kind of where I felt I had to draw a line. I said, there are legitimate arguments to be made that we cannot see everything through that lens. but to the extent that we do, we owe ourselves the responsibility to do it humanely. Now, if that was all that he was saying, I could say, okay, we're in agreement there. But he moves further than that. And in a subsequent book entitled Where the Wasteland Ends, he goes even further in that direction. And that's one that I don't keep because I have many more objections to it than I have sympathies. But I have brought back The Making of a Counterculture into my library. And again, it's probably going to stay there. It's one of those books that I reach for and I open to a random page. And there's something in there to stimulate me. Sometimes it's an irritation and sometimes it's an enlightenment. But I'm discovering that a lot of good books are like that they can tick you off just as much as they can make you smile or make you think. And this book in particular is probably also a good introduction to Roszak generally, because he has a number of other books. I mentioned one of them before that I was not enamored with, but he's done other stuff that has also been interesting. And while The Making of a Counterculture is not available digitally, it is available in relatively easy to get paperback editions. I actually went for a version that was the first printing just because that was what was available at the time. So if you're curious at getting perspectives, more or less from the inside, about how the mindsets from the 60s might well be something that you could use as a perspective for your story. Maybe you have a similar setting, maybe you have similar sentiments expressed on the parts of the characters in your story. Whatever the case may be, this is a good introduction to that. Get your hands on it if anything I've talked about here has stimulated a curiosity, and do see what you think.